I never expected to inherit anything from Grandpa Joe. We weren't particularly close, and I'd only visited his Tennessee farmhouse a handful of times during my childhood. But when the lawyer called last month, everything changed. The old man had left me his entire property, 47 acres of rolling hills, a century-old farmhouse, and memories I'd nearly forgotten. The drive from Chicago took 8 hours, giving me plenty of time to think. I remembered Grandpa as a quiet man who smelled like tobacco and spoke in measured sentences. He'd taught me to fish in the creek that ran through his property, but beyond that, our relationship had been distant. Mom always said he was a man who kept his feelings locked away, much like the old wooden chest he kept in his bedroom. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered. Paint peeled from the shutters, and the front porch sagged slightly on one side. The property felt abandoned, wild grass growing where Grandpa's vegetable garden once flourished, but the bones of the place were solid, and something about being there felt right. I'd come with a simple plan: assess the property, make necessary repairs, and decide whether to sell or keep it. The real estate agent had mentioned that the fence along the eastern border needed fixing before any potential sale. It seemed like a good place to start, a manageable project that would help me ease into the overwhelming task of dealing with Grandpa's legacy. Little did I know that fixing that fence would lead me to discover something that would change how I understood my family forever. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with the smallest steps. The next morning, I woke to the sound of roosters crowing from a neighboring farm. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows of Grandpa's bedroom, where I'd spent the night on sheets that smelled faintly of lavender and old memories. The silence was profound after years of city living. No traffic, no sirens, just the gentle sounds of rural life awakening. After a breakfast of instant coffee and stale crackers I'd found in the pantry, I set out to explore the property. The farmhouse sat on a small hill, offering views of the surrounding countryside. Behind the house, an old red barn leaned precariously to one side, its roof dotted with missing shingles. A rusty tractor sat nearby, probably older than I was. The eastern fence was exactly as the real estate agent had described. A disaster. Several posts had rotted through, and the wire hung loose in places where cattle from the neighboring farm had pushed through. It would take a full day's work to make it right, maybe 2 if I took my time. I walked the fence line, assessing the damage and making mental notes about materials I'd need. The property was beautiful in its wild state. Wildflowers dotted the meadows, and old oak trees provided shade along the creek that meandered through the southern portion of the land. I could see why Grandpa had loved this place. As I worked my way along the fence, I noticed something odd. Near where the fence met the creek, there was a gap that didn't look like typical cattle damage. The posts here were intact, but the wire had been deliberately cut and folded back, creating an opening just wide enough for a person to pass through. Someone had been using this as a pathway, and recently, the cut in the fence intrigued me more than it probably should have. I examined the wire closely. The cuts were clean, made with proper tools, not the jagged tears you'd expect from animals or weather damage. Someone had maintained this opening deliberately, and the worn grass on both sides suggested regular use. I decided to follow the path beyond the fence. It led down a gentle slope toward the creek, winding between old oak trees and through patches of wild blackberry bushes. The path was subtle but clear once you knew to look for it, a narrow track worn by countless footsteps over what must have been years. The creek here was wider than I remembered from childhood, probably 3 feet across and shallow enough to wade through easily. The water ran clear over smooth stones, and I could see minnows darting in the shadows. On the far side, the path continued up a small rise toward what looked like a grove of trees. I crossed the creek, my boots splashing in the cool water, and followed the path up the hill. The grove turned out to be a small cemetery, not the kind you'd find in town, but a family plot with maybe a dozen weathered headstones scattered among the trees. Most were so old the inscriptions had worn away, but a few were still readable. The newest grave was marked with a simple granite stone. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, 1924-1987, beloved wife and mother. Fresh wildflowers lay at its base, though they couldn't have been there more than a few days. Someone was still tending this grave, still walking that path through Grandpa's property to reach this quiet resting place. I stood there for a long time, wondering who Sarah Morrison was and why someone was maintaining her grave through my grandfather's land. That evening, I sat on Grandpa's front porch with a beer I'd bought in town, watching the sun set over the hills and thinking about the cemetery. The discovery had shifted something in my mind. This wasn't just about fixing a fence anymore. There was a story here, connections I didn't understand, and I found myself genuinely curious for the first time in years. I'd called Mom from town, hoping she might know something about the Morrison family or the cemetery, but she'd been as puzzled as I was. "Your grandfather never mentioned any neighbors using his property," she'd said. But then again, Joe wasn't one to share much about his daily life. That was true enough. Grandpa had been a man of few words, someone who expressed himself through actions rather than conversation. I remembered him teaching me to tie fishing knots with infinite patience, never speaking unless I asked a direct question. He'd shown love through quiet presence rather than words. The house felt different that night, less empty somehow. I found myself noticing details I'd missed before. The way he'd arranged his books, mostly farming manuals and old westerns, the careful way he'd maintained his tools in the mudroom, the photographs on the mantelpiece showing family gatherings from decades past. One photo caught my attention. Grandpa as a young man, maybe in his 30s, standing next to a woman I didn't recognize. She was pretty, with dark hair and a warm smile, and they stood close together in a way that suggested intimacy. But it wasn't Grandma. I had plenty of photos of her, and this woman was different. I studied the photo for a long time, wondering about the story it represented. Who was she? When was it taken? And why had I never heard about her? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. The next morning, I decided to postpone the fence repair and do some investigating instead. I drove into town to visit the local historical society, hoping someone might know about the Morrison family or the cemetery on the neighboring property. The Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who seemed to know everyone who'd ever lived in the county. When I mentioned the Morrison Cemetery, her eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh yes, the Morrison place," she said, settling into her chair with the satisfaction of someone about to tell a good story. "That family's been in these parts since before the Civil War. Sarah Morrison was the last of them to live on the old homestead. Sweet woman, kept to herself, mostly after her husband died in Vietnam." She pulled out a thick folder filled with newspaper clippings and old photographs. "Sarah never had children, you see. When she passed in '87, there was no family left to maintain the property. The state took it over, but they never did anything with it, just let it go back to nature." I studied the photos she showed me, pictures of the Morrison farmhouse before it fell into ruin, images of Sarah at various community events over the years. In one photo from the 1960s, she stood next to a man I didn't recognize at what looked like a church social. "Who's that with her?" I asked. "Mrs." Patterson squinted at the photo. "That's Joe Hartwell, your grandfather. They were close friends for many years. After his wife passed anyway. Some folks thought they might marry, but it never happened. Joe was always a private man." The pieces began falling into place. The path through the fence, the fresh flowers on Sarah's grave, the photograph in Grandpa's house. It all made sense now. I spent the rest of the day at the Historical Society, piecing together a story I'd never known existed. Mrs. Patterson was a treasure trove of local knowledge, and she seemed genuinely pleased to have someone interested in the area's history. "Your grandmother died in 1978, she explained, showing me an old obituary. "Cancer, poor thing. Joe was devastated. They'd been married 35 years. We all worried about him, living alone out there on the farm." She pulled out another folder. "Sarah's husband, Tommy Morrison, died in Vietnam in 1969. She was only 45, still young, but she never remarried, devoted herself to keeping the family farm running and taking care of her elderly parents." The timeline was becoming clear. Grandpa and Sarah had both lost their spouses, both found themselves alone in middle age. It made sense that they'd find comfort in each other's company. "They were very discreet about it," Mrs. Patterson continued. "This was a small town in the 1980s and people talked, but anyone with eyes could see they cared for each other. Joe would visit her place regularly, help with repairs and such, and Sarah would bring him meals when he was feeling poorly." She showed me a photo from a church picnic in 1985. Grandpa and Sarah sitting together on a blanket, sharing what looked like a private joke. They looked happy, comfortable with each other in a way that spoke of deep affection. "When Sarah got sick in '87, Joe was there every day," Mrs. Patterson said softly. "Sat with her at the hospital, made sure she wasn't alone. After she passed, he kept visiting her grave. Every week, regular as clockwork, until his own health started failing. I thought about the fresh flowers I'd found, the well-worn path through the fence. Grandpa had been making that journey for over 30 years. That evening, I returned to the farmhouse with a new understanding of the man who'd lived there. I found myself looking at everything differently. The careful way he'd maintained the property, the path to the creek, even the placement of his favorite chair by the window that faced east toward the Morrison place. I decided to explore the house more thoroughly, looking for other clues about Grandpa's relationship with Sarah. In his bedroom, I noticed something I'd missed before. The old wooden chest Mrs. Patterson had mentioned wasn't just sitting against the wall. It was positioned directly in front of what looked like a small door, almost hidden in the corner of the room. Moving the chest revealed a narrow door, maybe 4 feet high, that opened into a space under the eaves. I had to duck to enter, but inside was a small room with a slanted ceiling and a single window that looked out toward the Morrison property. It had been set up as a study of sorts, with a simple desk, a chair, and shelves lined with books. But it was what was on the desk that took my breath away. Letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon, all addressed to "My dearest Joe" in elegant handwriting. Next to them sat a small wooden box containing what looked like pressed flowers and a few pieces of simple jewelry. I sat in the chair and carefully untied the ribbon around the letters. The first one was dated September 15, 1979, just over a year after my grandmother's death. "Dear Joe," it began, "I hope you don't mind my writing, but I wanted you to know that you're in my thoughts during this difficult time." The letters chronicled the development of their relationship over 8 years, from friendship born of shared grief to something deeper and more meaningful. Sarah wrote beautifully, with warmth and humor and obvious affection for the man who'd become the center of her world. I spent hours reading Sarah's letters, completely absorbed in this love story I'd never known existed. Her writing revealed a woman of intelligence and grace, someone who understood Grandpa in ways I was only beginning to appreciate. "You asked me yesterday why I never remarried after Tommy died," one letter from 1982 read. "The truth is, I never thought I'd find someone who could understand the particular kind of loneliness that comes from losing your life partner. But you do understand, don't you? We're both people who loved deeply once and thought that chapter of our lives was over." Another letter from 1984 described a picnic they'd shared by the creek. "I love watching you fish, Joe. You have such patience, such quiet confidence. You don't feel the need to fill every moment with words, and I find that incredibly peaceful. Tommy was a talker, wonderful in his own way, but always needing conversation. With you, I can just be." The letters revealed small intimacies, Shared meals, long walks, quiet evenings reading together. They painted a picture of two people who'd found unexpected happiness in their later years, who'd built something beautiful and private away from the eyes of a small town that might not understand. One letter from 1986 made me pause. I know we've talked about making things more official, but I think what we have is perfect as it is. We don't need a piece of paper to validate what's in our hearts. Besides, I rather like our secret romance. It feels like something out of a novel. The last letter was dated just weeks before Sarah's death in 1987. Her handwriting was shakier, but the love in her words was unchanged. Whatever happens, Joe, I want you to know that these 8 years with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me a second chance at love when I thought such things were behind me. At the bottom of the wooden box, beneath the pressed flowers and jewelry, I found something that made my hands shake, a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Grandpa's careful handwriting. He'd known I would find this room, had planned for this moment. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter dated just 6 months before his death, along with a small brass key. Dear Michael, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means you've found Sarah's letters and learned about the most important relationship of my later life. I hope you understand why I never spoke of her while I was alive. Some things are too precious to share, even with family. He went on to explain how he'd met Sarah at my grandmother's funeral, how their friendship had slowly blossomed into love, and how they'd chosen to keep their relationship private to avoid small-town gossip and judgment. Sarah made me whole again after your grandmother died, he wrote. She taught me that the heart has room for more than one great love, that finding happiness again doesn't diminish what came before. I hope someday you'll understand that. The letter continued. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in town. Box 247. Inside you'll find something Sarah left for you. She insisted on it, even though she never met you. She said any grandson of mine was family to her. I stared at the key, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about a fence anymore, or even about inheriting property. This was about understanding that the people we think we know completely often have entire chapters of their lives hidden from us. Grandpa's final words in the letter were simple, but profound. Take care of her grave, Michael. She's waiting there for me, and someday we'll be together again. Until then, someone should remember that she was loved. The next morning, I drove to the bank with the brass key clutched in my hand. The safety deposit box was small, containing only a few items, but each one felt significant. There was a deed. Sarah had left me her property, all 40 acres of it, including the cemetery where she was buried. There was also a letter addressed to me, written in Sarah's elegant handwriting just days before her death. Dear Michael, it began, though we've never met, your grandfather has told me so much about you that I feel I know you. Joe loves you deeply, though he's not always good at showing it. He's proud of the man you've become. The letter explained her decision to leave me the property. I have no family left, and this land has been in the Morrison family for over a century. It seems wrong to let it pass to strangers when it could stay with someone who might understand its value. Joe tells me you're a good man with a kind heart. I trust his judgment. But it was her final paragraph that brought tears to my eyes. I'm leaving you more than just land, Michael. I'm leaving you the responsibility of remembering that love can bloom at any age, in any circumstances. Your grandfather gave me 8 wonderful years when I thought my life was over. Please don't let anyone forget that such love existed. The third item in the box was a small photo album filled with pictures I'd never seen. Grandpa and Sarah at various moments over their 8 years together. Fishing by the creek, working in her garden, sitting on her front porch in the evening light. In every photo, they looked content, complete. The final page contained a photo of them standing together by Sarah's grave, taken just months before she died. They were holding hands, and despite her obvious illness, she was smiling. On the back, someone had written, "Joe and Sarah, March 1987. Love endures." I spent the afternoon walking the Morrison property, seeing it with new eyes. The old farmhouse had collapsed years ago, but the foundation was still visible, along with the remnants of Sarah's garden. Wild roses climbed over what had once been a fence, and fruit trees she'd planted still bore apples and pears. The cemetery sat on a small hill overlooking the creek, peaceful and private. I counted 14 graves in total, spanning over a century of Morrison family history. Sarah's was the newest, but not the only one that showed signs of recent care. Grandpa had been tending the entire cemetery, maintaining this family's memory even after Sarah was gone. I sat by her grave for a long time, trying to process everything I'd learned. The man I'd thought I knew, quiet, reserved, emotionally distant, had actually been capable of deep love and profound devotion. He'd spent 30 years making a weekly pilgrimage to this spot, keeping alive the memory of a woman who'd given him a second chance at happiness. As the sun began to set, I walked back to the creek and followed the path Grandpa had worn with his footsteps. The fence repair that had brought me here seemed trivial now. Instead of fixing the gap in the fence, I decided to leave it open, a permanent gateway between the two properties that love had already joined. That evening, I called Mom and told her everything I'd discovered. She cried when I read her parts of Sarah's letters, and she admitted she'd always wondered why Grandpa had seemed different in his later years, happier, more at peace with himself. "I wish he'd told us," she said. "We would have welcomed her into the family." "I think he knew that," I replied. "But some love stories are meant to be private. Maybe that's what made it special." I've been living on the farm for 3 months now, and I've decided not to sell either property. Instead, I'm restoring both places, Grandpa's farmhouse as my home and Sarah's land as a memorial to their love story. I've started a small organic farm, growing vegetables and flowers, keeping the land productive and beautiful as they would have wanted. Every week, I walk the path between the properties and place fresh flowers on Sarah's grave. I've also started maintaining the entire Morrison cemetery, researching the family history and ensuring that their memory lives on. It feels like the right thing to do, a way of honoring not just Sarah, but the love she shared with my grandfather. I've learned so much about myself in these months. Like Grandpa, I'd always been someone who kept my emotions private, who struggled to express love openly. But reading Sarah's letters taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the foundation of real connection. I've also started writing letters to friends, journal entries about life on the farm, stories about the people who lived here before me. Sarah's eloquent words inspired me to find my own voice, to stop being afraid of expressing what's in my heart. The fence between the properties remains open, and I've created a small garden around the gateway with plants that bloom throughout the growing season. It's become a symbol of how love can bridge any divide, how two separate lives can become one beautiful story. Sometimes, in the evening light, I sit by the creek and imagine Grandpa and Sarah there together, sharing the quiet contentment that sustained them for 8 precious years. I understand now why he never spoke of her. Some things are too sacred for casual conversation. But I also understand that love stories deserve to be remembered, even the quiet ones that unfold away from the world's attention. Thank you so much for listening to this story about love, family, and the unexpected treasures we find when we're brave enough to look deeper into the lives of those who came before us. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and if this story reminded you of any hidden chapters in your own family's history. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel for more tales of family, memory, and the beautiful complexity of human relationships. Until next time, take care of each other, and remember that love stories are all around us if we just know where to look.